Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming in by San Diego standards, this bitterly cold weather tragedy we're having where this liquid is falling from the air in some inexplicable way. I'm John Evans. I'm the co-director of the Institute for Practical Ethics. Executive Vice Chancellor Elizabeth Simmons was supposed to be here to introduce, but she had to cancel at the last minute. I want to thank everyone for coming. Before I go further, I want to thank the staff of the School of Arts and Humanities who put this event together, Anthony King, Joel Adesso, and Allison Santera. So thank you. I will be brief. About 8 years ago, Craig Callender, who's the other co-director, and I were part of a process to create a new strategic plan for UCSD when the new chancellor arrived. We both noted that this is probably the largest research university in the United States, measured by research dollars, that didn't investigate the ethics of its own activity. And so therefore, we decided to create the Institute for Practical Ethics to study the social implications and ethics of emergent science, technology, engineering, and medicine. The need for the Institute was exemplified by AI. It wasn't even on our radar screen when we began talking about this, but it is now. This means that our technical abilities are developing so quickly that the Institute needs to exist to try to guide new technologies to advanced human interests. We cannot wait until new technologies have been institutionalized in society. By then, it's too late for them to be influenced. But I want to finish by saying Craig and I did not do this all on our own. We had a champion for the Institute who has nurtured us along the way, and that's Cristina Della Calata, Dean of Arts and Humanities, who I now ask to come to the front and give a few remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and welcome, everybody. The Institute for Practical Ethics annual keynote address is the primary way we can interact with the public about topics that are most relevant to the mission of the Institute. In these topics, we deal with some of the most relevant issues for society today. We bring in experts in their fields to present the ethical concerns of great scientific advancements, asking, should we clone the woolly mammoth at the Institute first keynote, to exploring the return of nature for environmental conservation at another one, and not surprisingly, establishing a human-centered approach to artificial intelligence in yet a third. As John intimated, artificial intelligence remains at the forefront of nearly everything these days. And I'm pleased that the Institute is focusing once again on this subject, which has such a broad reach and perhaps offers some of the biggest questions to answer. Before we get into the talk, I want to mention a few words about the Institute. And as a nod to today's discussion, my assistant dean, Anthony King, and I decided to rely on artificial intelligence to craft my opening statements. So here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues and distinguished guests, in a world confronted with unprecedented ethical challenges, the Institute for Practical Ethics stands as a beacon of intellectual rigor, ethical inquiry, and moral leadership. Today, as we gather to delve into the complexities of practical ethics, we embark on a journey of exploration, introspection, and dialogue. At the heart of our mission is a commitment to fostering critical conversations and advancing solutions to the ethical dilemmas shaping our society, whether we grapple with the ethical implications of emerging technologies, confront moral quandaries in healthcare and technology, or address the ethical dimensions of climate change and environmental sustainability. The Institute serves as a nexus for interdisciplinary scholarship and real-world impact. Well, what do you think? I think my dissertation advisor would be really upset at me if she knew I was relying on this as a literature professor. However, as we teach our students critical, clear, concise, and especially original thought, this is just a beginning. When we launched the Institute for Practical Ethics in the School of Arts and Humanities 7 years ago, 2 leaders emerged with a clear vision and the foresight to see it through. So congratulations, and thank you to John Evans and Craig Callender, who's teaching right now, for the direction and commitment to the Institute. I also want to thank again the staff in my office who was so instrumental in making this event possible. And I also thank David Danks for presenting, and it seems quite natural as a research university of our caliber, that an expert in artificial intelligence was not trained at UC San Diego. David is an alum of our philosophy department, but is a professor here today. And so some serious talk now about artificial intelligence. Please help me. No, actually, Corey is coming to the podium now. Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation, Corinne Peak-Assa, who will introduce David. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Christina. And yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to introduce Dr. Danks. I will say I'm old school, so I relied on Anthony and our research communications director, Deborah, to help me with my comments and to make sure I accurately introduce you to Dr. Danks. But I want to first talk a little bit about how broad and well-placed we are as a community at UC San Diego and broadly in our region to contribute to moving and optimizing the greatness of the tool that AI can be for us. There's a lot of fear, and that fear is really well-founded. And AI is such a long pipeline. What are the materials? How do we build the chips? What is the computing capacity? And how do we make sure there's access and democratization of access to that capacity? How do we build algorithms? How do we curate the data to make sure they are representative and accurate? And then, that's like the tree trunk. When we think about the applications in health, in climate, in manufacturing, and how we help businesses do administrative processes, it's, the branch is a huge tree already. And the only way that we are going to have a healthy tree that carries us into the future is if we nourish it with things like making sure we are ethical in guiding every decision that we make. And so for an example of how broad we are, just this morning, I had the pleasure of welcoming an NSF and national team who is working on, I have the wrong page, I just don't remember this name, a really pivotal investment with NSF, which is it's bringing together PIs, I can't find the name in my notes, the NSF-funded National Discovery Cloud for Climate Initiative. So this is an initiative that's bringing together people who are NSF PIs on AI development or climate decision-making and making sure there's a marriage between the data and the processes that we can use and apply that data. What I really would love is if we could have merged the meetings from this afternoon and this morning, because it's such a big, big world. But the people who are focused on the ethical, the democratization, the equity issues are the ones who are really going to create the guideposts around us to make sure our path is, again, optimizing AI as a tool. So again, as Christina said, we are so thankful to have thought leaders like David in our ranks. David holds an appointment in the Department of Philosophy and the Halajiolu Data Science Institute. So already we see just his very appointment is bringing these pieces together. And he's also an affiliate faculty member in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering. So in this whole tree of AI, he's part of the veins, bringing the water and the nutrients through the whole process. So his research interests range widely across philosophy, cognitive science, machine learning, including where these disciplines intersect, which is where the ethical conundrums are going to come from. He also has done significant research in computational cognitive science and developed multiple novel causal discovery algorithms for complex types of observational and experimental data. And as an ethicist, he's not just thinking about data in, process out. He's thinking about where does the data come from? Did we get it in a good way? Is it representing what it's supposed to? Then all the way out to how are we making decisions that impact how we're using that data? He is lauded and nationally known and internationally recognized for his expertise in this area. He's the recipient of the James McDonnell Foundation Scholar Award, as well as the Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, incredibly prestigious recognitions. He serves on multiple advisory boards, including the National AI Advisory Committee, the Computer Science and Telecommunications Board of the National Academies, the Responsible AI Council for the Department of Defense, and the Salesforce Ethical and Responsible Use Advisory Council. Prior to joining UC San Diego in 2021, David was the L.L. Thurstone Professor of Philosophy and Psychology at Carnegie Mellon University, also a university that's well known for having the breadth of the really strong basic science, applied science, translational science, and then the themes of how do we do all that in the best ethical, equitable way. He received his PhD in philosophy, as Christina said, here at UC San Diego. So another thing I just want to say about something I really, really appreciate with David, he does not just have this expertise sitting in his head and applying it in sort of scientific discovery. He shows up again and again and again to make sure we're disseminating this knowledge for decision makers. So I, for example, have seen him testifying in Congress. I've seen him being at Hill events with press to make sure there's good public dissemination of helping understand these complicated things. He presents at universities for public audiences, for scientific audiences across the world. So I just appreciate the knowledge and his being so generous in sharing it with all of us. And so I will now be quiet and let him do just that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for coming out. I feel like now I should just sit back down because there's no possible way I could live up to that. So thank you, Corey, for that wonderful introduction. So the topic that's on the title slide there is obviously far too broad. I would not even presume to consider all of the ethical and policy implications of AI in an entire class. Any students in the room? Data ethics next quarter. It'll be a lot of fun. So I decided to take a cue from the fact that this is the Institute for Practical Ethics and to think about the ways in which the ethical issues arise in very practical ways, the ethical issues concerning AI and its proliferation in all of our lives. So I wanted to start by telling you three stories. The first is I want to invite you to go back to the dim ages of 2016. I know, very long ago. Back when we thought Corona was just a beer. In 2016, at the time I was living in Pittsburgh, my daughter was in 7th grade. And one day, as she's walking to school, a new kind of car appeared on the roads. This is the vehicle that was developed by Uber ATG, the first developer of autonomous cars that were being tested on surface streets in the United States in any sort of systematic way. These were being tested in the neighborhood that we lived in, Shadyside. So every day, my daughter is walking to school with these cars driving on the streets right next to her. Now, there's a driver in the front, but I happen to know a lot of the people at Uber ATG. And they're like, oh yeah, we tell the drivers, don't grab the wheel. Unless you really have to, don't grab it. That's what they did at the time. They had different guidance later. But they were trying to see just how well the vehicles could perform. And I'm thinking to myself, my daughter's walking on the sidewalk. I didn't vote for this. The city council in Pittsburgh never voted for this. It was simply imposed on us as residents of the city of Pittsburgh, that these were going to be tested in certain neighborhoods. And it wasn't in every neighborhood. To their credit, it was it wasn't like they only tested in the poor, minority, underrepresented neighborhoods. They were testing it in a diverse set of neighborhoods. But nonetheless, we didn't have a say in it. And that was a bit of a problem. Now I want to update you to a couple years later. I get a call from a friend who was heading up a data analytics group at a hospital. Because even in 2018, hospitals were really starting to wrestle with issues of burnout. This is even prior to COVID. There were enormous problems that the staff were just being asked to do too much. And they were really concerned that they weren't able to predict the possibility of burnout with their staff. And so what they really wanted to do was see if they could predict it. Like, they've got a lot of data on their staff. Maybe they could predict which which doctors, which RNs might be at risk of burnout, so they could take proactive measures to help keep their staff healthy. And they thought, well, as long as we're looking at certain kinds of data, when do they show up? We've got all of their, personal records about things like their social media profiles. So why don't we start monitoring their social media as well? I mean, it'll surely help us to predict whether they're at risk of burnout. Wouldn't this be a great idea? I suspect many of you in the audience are going, wait a second, that doesn't seem like a great idea. And yet it was a very natural thought to have. They did not end up doing that. But it was a challenge. Or think about just 14, maybe let's call it 16 months ago, when ChatGPT entered into most of our lives. And suddenly we thought very differently about AI than we had before. For many people, AI went from being this abstract thing that happens in computer science labs, and maybe it's happening in some back room somewhere, to being something that they could use to help do their own job better, to be able to translate their own not great writing into clearer writing. It also could be used to generate, in a very fast and effective way, phishing emails, spam, misinformation, disinformation. And it can be hard to remember that these kinds of systems only, 18 months ago, I would be willing to bet almost no one in this room had ever heard of a transformer model. Yes, computer scientists, I know you had heard of a transformer model. But most people hadn't. And in less than 18 months, we've gone from most people going, transformer, that's the toys that maybe somebody had played with when they were younger, or some bad Michael Bay movies, to suddenly these are things that are a part of everybody's life and are upending entire sectors of our economy. When companies go from advertising 50 jobs to post-GPT, advertising 5. It's a pretty standard ratio that we're seeing in things like advertising copy. 90% drops in the number of jobs that are being advertised. This is having massive impacts. And again, it just appeared. And that's a theme of all three of these stories. In all three, what we have is we have people imposing the AI on the rest of us without asking us, without talking to us, without trying to figure out, is this the right thing for us to do? And I deliberately use the word right because that's where the ethics starts to come in. Okay? But what these are more generally pointing to is the need for what we can think of as governance. Right? Now, governance is a sort of very broad, amorphous term, but we need to think about how it is that we are governing our AI systems. How do we get them from where they are now to where we want them to be? So when we think about governance, what we usually, one way to think about it, the political scientists in the room may roll their eyes at me for this, but one way to think about it is that on the one hand, we've got our principles. We've got the things that we think are important when we're thinking about AI. It should help us. It should be trustworthy. We should understand how it works. It should be fair and unbiased in crucial ways. But principles are high level. They don't connect to the everyday world. They don't tell us what we should do. And on the other hand, we have the outcomes that we want to achieve, the things that matter to us, the respecting of human rights in the everyday decisions that come out of an automated decision system, the ways in which these systems are capable of implementing our intentions, that the ways that we want to control the system actually manifest in the systems doing what it is that we want. And we can think about governance as a kind of interface layer. Governance is the way that we try to translate and realize our principles so that the technology gets us the outcomes we want. That's one way to think about governance. And when I say it that way, you might say, well, that doesn't sound very much like ethics. Except that's a key part of ethics. Ethics is in part about how it is that we translate our values, the things that matter to us, into our actions, both individual and collective. We value being, I'll personalize this. I value being a good parent. I value being a good teacher. Those come into conflict. Ethics is in part about how we resolve these kinds of value conflicts. That's on the personal level. I value a good meal. I value being in a city where we reduce the homeless population. How do I reconcile those kinds of conflicts? Governance is a way that we do it at the social level, at the community level. How do we collectively start to realize our principles in ways that can lead to the outcomes we care about? So when we think about governance, we can think about it as on a continuum. There are many kinds of governance. Now, the most obvious one, the one that many people think of, is regulation. That's a sort of very, very hard form of governance. That is the state telling people, you must do this, you cannot do this. But governance extends all the way down to peer pressure. Peer pressure is a form of governance. You might say, wait a second, what do you mean by peer pressure? Well, that's one way that we get ourselves to work together collectively towards, say, having a fair and unbiased AI system. If the people in a company say, come on, we can't put that out there, it's biased. That's a form of peer pressure. If people say, yeah, you don't want to go work for that company, I'll let you fill in the blanks of who you have in mind. Don't go work for that company because they're not ethical. That's a form of governance. Right? So peer pressure is a way that we can achieve the kinds of outcomes we want and realize our principles. And there's a whole host of different forms in between. So I want to take a moment here to talk a bit about these different kinds of governance, to give you an understanding of the landscape. And I promise I'll come back and explain why. But I think it's important to understand what it is that's going on right now in terms of AI governance. Because sometimes there's the view that there is no governance of AI. It's just the Wild West. Who knows what's happening? We're just getting hit with this tsunami of technology. But I think that's actually the wrong way to think about it. There's actually an enormous amount going on right now in AI governance, and it can be helpful to know about this. So let's start with regulation, where frequently you'll hear the claim that there is no AI regulation. That's actually not true. In the US, we actually have quite a bit of AI regulation. It just happens through agencies in ways that you don't necessarily notice because they don't tell you that they're regulating AI. So we have things like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is charged with enforcing the ethical value, the public value of non-discrimination in hiring. And 14 months ago, December of 22, the General Counsel of the EEOC comes out with a letter, a sort of public, what they call Dear Colleague letter, a public declaration that the EEOC is not going to care whether you use AI in hiring. If you are discriminating in hiring in terms of the outcomes that occur, they're going to come and investigate. And companies said, wait, what do you mean? It's not our fault if the AI is discriminatory. That's the company that sold us the AI. And the EEOC said, okay, go take it up with them. We're still going to investigate you. Because our task is to implement the public value of non-discrimination in hiring. And it doesn't matter if you use AI or not, we're coming after you if you violate that value. The Securities and Exchange Commission is coming after companies for violation of, basically financial regulations, whether they're using AI or not. The Food and Drug Administration is regulating medical devices, whether they have AI or not. So there's actually quite a lot of regulation that's occurring in the US. It just isn't under the label of AI. In contrast, in the EU, they're very much trying to regulate AI writ large. It's cross-sectoral, to use the technical language, which is to say, AI regardless of the use, regardless of the domain. Okay? Now there's a focus on the high consequence uses, the problematic ones, but there we have regulation that is going to phase in over the next 2 years that is going to put significant burdens on companies that are using AI in potentially consequential cases to show that it is unbiased and trustworthy and all the things that we might want. So it's a very sort of hard form of regulation. A little bit jumping over to the softer side, we have things like funding. The NSF, the NIH, DARPA, to use federal agencies, but also foundations, private entities, Schmidt Futures, Chan Zuckerberg, are using their financial might to help shape where AI goes. Right now, there's a call out for a new round of NSF-funded AI institutes, where 2 of them are going to focus on what is it for AI to be trustworthy and aligned with human values and public values. And this is a way that the federal government in this case is trying to push where we go with AI systems by saying, we're going to give you money to investigate these things, not those things. And that's a much softer form, right? It's a carrot, not a stick, if you're thinking about governance. We have standards emerging, international ones, such as ISO 42001. Right? These emerge from multilateral negotiations and are an attempt to say, here's what we really ought to be doing in terms of what it is to meet the burden of having a good, responsible AI system, in this case, around risk management. Down in the peer pressure and social norms, we see the emergence of codes of conduct from professional societies such as the ACM. We see people, like me, teaching classes, teaching the next generation. This is just how you build a good AI system, so that hopefully they go out into the workforce and look at their other folks on their team and say, well, why aren't we testing for bias? Isn't that just what we're supposed to do? Trying to establish social norms of what it is to be a responsible, a good AI developer. Right? We have best practices emerging from, for example, the UK AI Safety Institute, the US AI Safety Institute. Don't ask about the differences between them. It mostly comes down to the UK is well-funded, the US is not. But both are trying to establish best practices. Now, you might say best practices. How is that governance? How does that shape what we build? Well, it shapes because that's what people will then do. So if a best practice is that you make sure that people understand your AI system, that people can explain why it gave the answer it did. If that's a best practice, then we're going to get the AI that we want, the AI that satisfies the values that we have potentially. Okay? There are, of course, things that bridge across these. We have risk management frameworks that are kind of a blend between best practices and standards. We have Executive Order 14110 that came out last October, which is essentially the White House telling the executive branch, here's what you need to do if you're going to be using AI to benefit the American people. It's somewhere between a standard and full-on regulation. Okay? So this slide is dense, and that's the point. The point is that there is a lot of AI governance happening right now. Now, many of these are still in progress. Many of these are half-baked. Many of these are things that we're all trying to figure out right now. That's a certain amount of the research that's going on in this field. But a lot of my research, in the past decade plus, a lot of it has been contributing to some of these, trying to help fill in some of these aspects of how we might govern. But in the last few years, a lot of my work has turned instead to finding the ethical gaps. Where are the things that are falling through this framework, this dense set of mechanisms that we're starting to proliferate out into the world? Where are the things that are nonetheless falling short? What are the ethical challenges that we are missing with the approaches that we're taking to governance? Where are the things that might make it so that we would get a repeat of what happened in Pittsburgh when self-driving cars were suddenly on our roads and we didn't want it? You might be thinking to yourself, well, wait, that's what happened 6 months ago in San Francisco when the California Public Utilities Commission said, sure, you can have self-driving taxis with no human driver in them. And the people, the residents, citizens of San Francisco said, wait a second, we didn't sign up for that. But it came down from the state. You might think that's a failure of governance. I'll come back to it in a few minutes. So I wanted to talk through 2 case studies. In each case study, there's an ethical gap that arises given the ways that we're trying to govern AI systems today. And I want to try and talk you through what that ethical risk is, what is the challenge that we face, and to propose some policy solutions that might enable us to move past and overcome these ethical challenges. So hopefully this will give you a flavor for the kinds of things that are happening right now in terms of trying to ensure that our AI systems actually do respect the values that we share. Okay. Now, before I start into those case studies, I want to take one brief might sound like a detour, but it's important to make sure to say. When we think about AI systems and the ethical implications, the ethical nature of AI systems, it's very easy to focus on the use. Right? To think of an AI system sort of like a hammer. We don't think about the ethics of hammers until somebody uses them in horrific ways or beneficial ways. That would be a mistake when it comes to AI. Ethical issues arise from the very beginning, all the way through from design to development to iterative development and refinement to the use and deployment to revision to decisions to sunset a system and say we're no longer going to use it. The decision to build an AI system in the first place is already an ethical choice. There are many things I could do with my time The decision to build an AI system to, for example, predict blood pressure crashes during surgery, a project that we're working on right now, that decision is an ethical choice. I'm saying this is a problem that matters. The way in which we say what counts as success is an ethical choice. If somebody wanted to build, as many universities are, not to the best of my knowledge UCSD, which I think is a good thing, but many universities are building systems to predict acute mental health crises of their students. Because most universities, pretty much all of them, have overwhelmed counseling services. They simply do not have the ability to provide the counseling support that is needed for all of their students. And if they could predict who might be at highest risk, then that would be great because we could optimize our counseling, the delivery of counseling services. There are, of course, enormous problems with that. How do you define success? How do you figure out what data it's acceptable to use? How do you decide when to roll it out? Who gets access to those predictions? What do you do about the fact that those predictions will inevitably sometimes be wrong? What's the recourse when you go to somebody and say, we think you might be at risk, and they say, no, I don't think I am, but that can actually precipitate a mental health crisis, as we saw with early versions of Facebook's suicidality detector. So the ethical challenges with AI don't show up right at the very end. They show up right at the very beginning. The entire life cycle of an AI system is just threaded throughout with ethical choices. So the examples I give you, it might be easy to think, well, those are for somebody else to deal with. Those are for the policymakers at the end to deal with. But these are going to be issues that arise right from the very beginning. So let me dive into those two case studies now. The first is on an issue that we refer to as ethical interoperability. This is joint work with a fantastic postdoc, Dan Trusillo. Dan's sitting there. He's looking very embarrassed right about now. So the problem of ethical interoperability, remember, what's the ethical gap? What's the ethical challenge here? The ethical challenge is the following. Let me start out by explaining it through an example. One of the very first adopters of ethical AI principles in the United States, interestingly enough, was the US Department of Defense. They were one of the very first for a long time. They had the most comprehensive set of ethical AI principles of basically any organization in the US. Now, you might be a little bit surprised by that, but there is a very long history within the military, not just in the US, but worldwide, of the importance of ethics, the importance of ensuring that we behave honorably during the horrific conditions that are conflict, right? The importance of being able to recognize this is crossing an ethical line, we ought not do it. And of course, there have been horrific atrocities committed by soldiers historically, but those are in many cases used exactly as the examples of what we ought not be doing. Okay? So the professional ethics of a warfighter, of a soldier, is something that every effort is made to instill from the very beginning. So from that perspective, it's perhaps not surprising that the Department of Defense was very worried, still is very worried, about how they could use AI ethically. And let me just be clear, the use of AI here is everything from supply chain management, how do we get gas into airplanes, to healthcare, because the US DoD is actually the largest provider of healthcare in the United States, to, in fact, potentially the conduct of war. We have seen autonomous weapons used on the battlefield, not by the US, but in both Syria and Ukraine. Autonomous weapons have been used. This is not something, killer robot ideas are not something for the future. These are something that are here now. And so the DoD adopted these principles. They were essentially adopted in 2019. It became official in 2020. But it's not just the US. So Australia has its own set of ethical principles. They went through their own process to develop. And I could go on and on. NATO has a set of principles. The UK has a set of principles. Canada has a set of, every military that we are friends with has a set of ethical AI principles that have been publicly disclosed. And these are, in fact, realized in the kinds of projects that they undertake. So you've got things on the left. This is an effort by the US military to essentially have coordination of information as fused and synthesized and understood through AI. Don't worry about understanding anything in that really dense slide. On the right, you've got Project Jericho, a project of the Royal Australian Air Force, which is the same sort of idea. How do we, fuse together a lot of different information? Here's the problem of ethical interoperability. We play nicely with the Australians. We conduct operations with the Australians. We would like our systems to be able to talk to each other. But the problem is our ethical AI principles are not the same. They have their own set, we've got our own set. So given that, when are we ethically permitted to use information from the Australians? Right? Well, when they give it to us, except what if what they did violated our ethical principles? We don't want to set up a world where we are able to ethically outsource things. And I don't mean ethically outsource in the good way. I mean we outsource our ethics, right? We go, yeah, I know I'm not allowed to do that. But Corey's in another country. They don't have the same ethical AI principles there. So we're going to let them do the really horrific things that violate people's privacy, that are biased, that are not governable in the ways that we would want. And then we'll let her bring that information back to us. That would be an enormous ethical failing if we set up systems whereby we could just outsource things in exactly the way that we have seen happen in manufacturing supply chains, where we can't do it here, so we outsource it elsewhere to where we can do it. From an ethical point of view, we ought not do this. Right? I'm not deliberately using the word ethical there. Legal is a different question. But ethically, we ought not. If we are going to take our own ethical principles seriously, then at the very least, they should mean that we should not take on information, decisions, content that come from somebody who violated those ethical principles. Now, you might think, all right, well, that's for militaries. But of course, it also can arise in everyday context. Suppose that you are a startup or a small or medium-sized organization. You're trying to use AI to disrupt things, to have a really good valuation so you can sell, whatever it may be. But you've got your ethical principles. There are lines you're not going to cross. But most startups, most small organizations, actually aren't building their own AI systems by themselves. They're partnering. They're working with Google AI services. They're working with Microsoft Azure. They're working with Amazon Web Services. They're working with Hugging Face. Right? They're working with other companies. Right? They're going onto their platforms. They're saying, I'm going to upload my data, build all the models there, and then I can run things on your platform. Well, all of those companies, all four of them around the outside, have ethical AI principles. They have their principles. All four of them are different. They are not the same. And most of the time, they will not be the same as that company that's in the middle. So who can they use? Do I get to use Microsoft Azure just because, well, they'll do things that I wouldn't, so I'll use them, whereas Google Cloud wouldn't do that, so I'm not going to use them. That would be ethical outsourcing. And the way in which AI systems are built today is in a distributed manner. Constantly, this vision you might have of like this one company that does everything from data collection to deployment, that is largely a fiction these days. There are very few products that are out there that where people are using AI that are built by just one group or one company. It's almost always distributed. And everyone's got their ethics, but yet everybody is going their own direction. So what Dan and I have done is argued for and developed a sort of policy response. And the details in some sense don't matter. What matters is it's feasible, for the most part. It is something that could be done right now. And it is something we could do to help ensure in a customizable, adaptive way that we aren't outsourcing our ethics. That we aren't sitting there saying to our customers, oh, no, what we're doing doesn't violate our ethics. And you can see our ethical principles. While meanwhile, what we're doing is we're sending all the dirty laundry out the back door to be handled by somebody else. Right? So this is an example of the kind of way in which things can fall through the gaps, the way in which we can have ethical failings, even despite all of those governance things that are out there. Because the governance mechanisms that are out there are almost entirely targeted at one organization at a time. It's how do you build this project when you have, or product when you have full control over it. And the reality is we don't have full control over most of the products we're building in AI anymore. What we're doing is we're working in teams, we're working in collaborations. And of course, we could handle all of this legally, right? We just sign a contract that says, well, we promise we're not going to do something horrible. But there's no way to follow through on that. Part of the reason that these are challenging is that, go back to the DoD, US DoD and the Royal Australian Air Force, we're not going to tell them what's on the inner workings of our AI systems from the US, and they're not going to tell us what's in the inner workings of their AI systems. We might share information, we might share outputs, but we're not sharing the actual code. We're not sharing the development practices and histories by which we built these systems. We're not sharing with them who did we talk to, which values are we prioritizing in these systems. So the challenge of ethical interoperability is how do we ensure that we're not deliberately or unintentionally outsourcing our ethics when we can't get the information we need to know that we have done it correctly. And so that's what the policy proposal aims to do. Let me give a second example. So here's another ethical challenge. I mentioned standards at the outset, standards and even best practices. The majority of standards that are out there and are being proposed right now are essentially static in the sense that you're either certified or you're not. So we saw this, I already mentioned this, but with the California Public Utilities Commission when they said, yep, you can use automated taxis, autonomous taxis with no human driver anywhere in the city of San Francisco on any surface street in any condition. Right? You're either approved or you're not. And that's what the CPUC process does. There is no, if you actually read the rules, and please don't, they are real, unless you need to go to sleep, they are what you would expect from a government document. But I will tell you, if you're willing to trust me, if you read through those documents, there is no mechanism by which the CPUC could say, well, you can't function at night. They actually aren't able to do that. The law doesn't permit them to do that. You're either approved for the roads or you're not. Just like a new car is either approved for the roads or not. Just like a taxi driver is either approved to drive a taxi because they've got a medallion or they're not. And we see this over and over. As we're seeing the emergence of AI regulation, it is almost always of the static form. In fact, we're now seeing a whole new sector, a whole new business sector, which is AI certification and licensing. And if you go and look at what they do, it is almost always static. It's tell us what you did, we'll test it for bias, and we'll give you this check mark that says, yep, you pass. And maybe you have to come back 3 years later so they can check you again. Okay. Now, in fact, to the point that in New York City, you have to, if you're going to use an automated system in employment decisions, there's a law, New York 144, that requires you to do annual bias testing. But that bias testing is simply that you did an audit and somebody was willing to give you a green check mark. Yep, you pass. There's actually no rules on what you have to do to pass, which is a problem. And so we've got this whole industry of people who are selling, literally, certifications that look a lot like a license. And these certifications are all of the static form. And the problem is that these kinds of normal certifications typically lack an understanding of what makes AI distinctive. Right? They ignore the fact that these systems are being deployed in really complicated, complex environments. Just think about driving. Anybody who's ever taught a teenager to drive, first of all, my sympathies, I went through it, right? But one of the things you learn is that it's like, if it's dusk and it's a crowded road and it's raining, maybe that's a time that you need to work with them to be extra careful. We all are used to the idea that you adjust the ways that we behave in response to the context. But one of the things that AI systems are currently very bad at is recognizing context and recognizing the complexity of context. That feeling you get when you're driving, you're like, all right, this is just getting weird. I need to be extra vigilant. And we've probably all had that feeling. AI systems are terrible at that. That's what they are not good at. They're amazing at certain things. Recognizing context is not one of them. Static certifications typically fail to recognize the ways in which the introduction of AI can actually change the world around them. I watched this happen in Pittsburgh when autonomous vehicles show up in our neighborhood and suddenly people change their behaviors. Suddenly people were perfectly willing to jaywalk in front of these cars, which might shock you, except everybody basically figured there is no way Uber's going to let these things hit a pedestrian. They've got this thing coded so conservatively, and it's not going to annoy the car, so I'll just walk out in front of it. I was not one of those people. I made sure my daughter was not one of those people. But yet I watched people do this. And I'm that guy who would go up and ask them, so, did you know that was an Uber car? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't have walked out in front of a normal Pittsburgh driver. They would just hit me. Right? So the world changes in response to the introduction of technology. And what's really at the core of all of these challenges to normal certification, the static kinds of certification, I think is really two things. The first is that AI should surprise us. Now, most people go, wait, what? We don't want to be surprised by AI. But if we know what the AI should do, why are we using AI? The whole point of using AI is that it can discover patterns that we don't recognize. It can discover novel solutions to problems that never would have occurred to us. It's that it can process billions of data points at a moment, not a moment, but you know what I mean, and find new ideas that we humans could not do. We are amazing in certain ways, but AI is amazing in certain ways. And we want it to surprise us. But if we want it to surprise us, then that means that it's going to be very difficult for us to sit down and say, here's exactly what counts as success. And it's going to be even more complicated when we recognize that many of the things we value are vague and hard to articulate. So when we think about, and sorry to keep coming back to this, but think about, again, autonomous vehicles. And think about, just think about cars. Cars right now we certify with two different systems. We certify the physical car with things that we can clearly state. It must be able to stop in this distance from this speed in these conditions. And then we certify the human, in part because what do we value? We value safe drivers. What's a safe driver? Well, we kind of know, right? The person who runs a red light, not a safe driver. The person who goes 150 miles an hour on I-5, not sure when, but if they could, that person's not a safe driver. But also the person who would go 15 miles an hour on I-5 is not a safe driver. And, is it a safe driver when the road's closed? And so you have to figure out what turn are you going to make? Right? Again, context matters. And safety is a tricky notion. We don't know how to pin it down into a set of certifications that we could say, do this, and you're certified as safe. So what we've been developing, and this is joint work with a number of people, this has been proceeding over a number of years to get to having a sort of fully fledged policy proposal. In good faith, I want to make sure to name, Heather Roth, Alex London, Georgios Bakitsis, I always get his name wrong, sorry, Georgios, Steve Carr, Ufuk Topku, and some others, is a system for dynamic certification. A system that enables us to, in very principled ways, go through stages where we come to understand the context dependence of the performance of our AI systems, and in ways that we can iteratively figure out what is it that we should allow them to do, what is it that we should not allow them to do. And figuring out how to do this in a way that could be pretty straightforwardly implemented by a wide range of federal and state agencies. In fact, we already have a model for it. Dynamic certification is what the FDA does with pharmaceutical agents. It's how we go from a drug being approved for one condition under the direct supervision of a doctor to ibuprofen, right? That was not here's the standard for being usable over the counter. We only get to over the counter over time. And so what we've been doing is moving closer and closer to having a very clear policy recommendation, rules that could be implemented across many different agencies. And in fact, we've shown how to apply this in cases of autonomous delivery drones. That's what Georgia, Steve, and Ufuk work on, is autonomous aerial delivery drones. Think Amazon copters dropping off your packages for you, and showing how we can actually implement this technically. What is the technical knowledge that is needed in order to do dynamic certification in a formally precise way? Okay. So again, ethical challenge, the things that we only want to have AI being used when we can actually trust it, when it carries out our values, and current governance doesn't allow that. Policy solution. Here's a way that we can actually ensure iteratively, dynamically over time that the AI is doing what we wanted. So I want to close by just pointing towards what I think is a direction that perhaps we should go. So this is now me being an advocate for what are some possible futures for AI governance. Where do we need to get to? What are the things that, when I look at the ethical landscape of the ways in which AI is impacting us, that I think these are gaps that we're going to have to learn to fill? And I'll go back to that same continuum. I think one of the key challenges that we face is how, from a regulatory perspective, do we ensure that all harms, even those that people don't know about, that they learn about and they have a chance to have recourse for them? The privacy violation that you never know about because it is the reason that you were simply denied a loan or never shown a job ad. And so there's a whole career path that you didn't even realize might be available to you. That's a harm, but it's one you'll never notice. Sorry for those of you who are watching on the Zoomcast, the Alexa in your house that may or may not be listening to you. How would you know? Right? So that's a big regulatory move that I think we need to make. How do we enable people to understand the harms that are potentially befalling them and have recourse for them when they don't have any way to find out? Usually when I'm harmed, I know, right? Money disappeared from my bank account. Somebody physically harms me. I know. But AI is making it possible to allocate resources, to make decisions, to shape people's lives in ways that they will never notice the harms being done to them. So how do we ensure that the power of the state corrects that imbalance? Because in most cases, the companies do know about the harms they're doing, but they have no incentive to tell you. So that's a classic case where regulation can reshape things. When we think about standards, we need to move. This is a wonderful recent book by Ben Schneiderman, Human-Centered AI. But what we need to have is we need human-centered standards. We need to move away from standards that focus on the code, that focus on the technology, and instead focus on the human side of things. As Corey mentioned, I'm lucky enough to serve on the National AI Advisory Committee. We actually had a 3-hour briefing yesterday with 15 experts from industry, academia, civil society on what is AI safety. And these 15 experts disagreed on almost everything, but there was one thing they all agreed on. Safety is not about the code. Safety is about the broader socio-technical environments in which we use AI and what we use it for. And so we need standards that similarly are geared to the human impacts. When we think about best practices, we need to think about and find ways to expand the expertise. Sometimes people will say, well, no one knows how to build trustworthy AI. That's wrong. There are, if I had to guess, order of magnitude, maybe 1,000 people in the world that you could give them pretty much any AI idea, predicting an acute student mental health crisis. And they could tell you how to build it in a trustworthy and responsible way. There's maybe 1,000 people in the world. They could do that. But it will be a customized, bespoke solution to that particular case. And the real challenge is not just that it would be customized, but is how do we go for, we need it to not be 1,000. We need it to be 100,000 people who know how to do this. We need to democratize the knowledge of how to build these systems responsibly and in trustworthy ways. We need to also know that I'm coming to the end of my time, so I wanted to say thank you, and we've got time for questions.
So, thank you very much, David. Fascinating talk. We have time for some questions. I've got people with microphones on the side, so if anyone want to raise their hand and ask a question, we'll get you a microphone. Yes, right there.
Yeah, do you think there'll come a time where the AI systems are more trustworthy than humans?
So I think that for certain tasks and in certain contexts, they already are. I think self-driving cars, if I'm on I-40 in Oklahoma on a sunny, clear day, I trust an autonomous truck, especially, but also car, more than I would trust a human. For the simple reason that humans are really bad at doing the same thing for extended periods of time. If you've ever driven across Oklahoma, you know what I'm talking about. So already, they're more trustworthy for some things. Now, Do I ever think we're going to have robot nannies that I would rather trust my daughter to, or someday a granddaughter, maybe, rather than my wife? No, probably not that. Or if we do, it's going to be a long ways off. But I think we need to recognize that trustworthiness is always relative to what we're trying to achieve and the context in which we're doing it. And I think there are uses and contexts right now where AI is more trustworthy than most humans. But those are few and far between. And those tend not to be the cases that companies are trying to make money off of. And I think right now, most of what is out there in sort of the public domain, I would not call more trustworthy than most humans. I would say it is more reliable in the sense of giving the same answer every time, but not more trustworthy, precisely because the systems are not able to adapt to changes in context and needs.
Okay. Up here? Yep.
I think if on this particular slide and this particular set of examples, the questions that it raises for me, and I'd welcome your comments. One is that there's a political context to agencies designing both rules and regulations that they are going to enforce. The current administration has a different orientation than the previous administration. So there's a whole political will kind of narrative that will influence and runs through this whole continuum. And the second question is the economic incentive that really lies at the heart of much of what we've seen recently in terms of the explosion. Also provides kind of, if you will, incentive to be very different than what you are describing. So I'm wondering if you could comment both about the politics of AI and the economic incentives of AI, and how that will both impede the development of what you're talking about or accelerate it.
So going for the nice, easy questions. So on the political side, you're absolutely right. Different administrations have different priorities. Different Congresses have different priorities. Different Congresses have different abilities to actually pass legislation. So part of what's needed, I think, is, one path, the one that I personally have tried to pursue, is to find governance mechanisms that are relatively uncontroversial. The idea that companies building health apps should not be monetizing their predictions of whether you have a disease, which right now they are allowed to do, that I find to have bipartisan support, that we should try to rein in the monetization of your inferred health characteristics by companies. The monetization of inferred educational capabilities of students from ed tech. Again, pretty straightforward to get bipartisan agreement on that one. There are inevitably issues where it's much harder to get that. And I wish I could give you a clean, easy answer. Unfortunately, the sausage is as ugly in the making as you would suspect. And that's one of the concerns about things like an executive order, which that came out in October, or the one that came out just a couple of days ago about not having export of sensitive data about U.S. citizens to countries of concern. Executive orders can be reversed on day one of a new administration. And so I do think that it's a challenge to figure out how to translate these things. I'm trying really hard not to give the glib, unsatisfactory answer of saying, well, but I'm an ethicist, because that's not right. It's important to think about what should be the case, but then work to try and make it happen. I'm actually more optimistic on the economic side. So let me come to that one and maybe end on a somewhat more optimistic note. The holy grail in marketing is to be a trusted brand. And there's a whole science of how you try to do that. The idea that you can charge a price premium for things that support people's values, simply look at the ways in which Apple has charged a price premium for the last decade because of their design and the ways in which their design makes it much easier for people to accomplish certain kinds of things. In fact, I'm part of a project that's just getting started, basically trying to measure the return on investment, the ROI, of building more trustworthy AI systems. Because pretty much everybody that I talk to who's looked into this believes that it is a long-term positive ROI to build trustworthy AI rather than just ordinary untrustworthy AI systems. But we need to have the data to demonstrate it. And precisely because then we change the narrative. That it changes away from how do we move fast and break things to how do we support people, because that's how you make a lot of money in the long run. So we're trying, but we're not there yet.
Okay, in the back.
Here's a microphone for you.
Thank you. You're welcome. You mentioned the expectation that someone graduating at 22 with a data science major should be ready to go out in the world and develop AI. I'm just wondering if maybe that's an unrealistic expectation, considering the consequences to society if they don't do it well. And maybe it should more resemble that of a medical student who, when he graduates med school, is certainly not ready to operate. He needs to do a residency and a fellowship.
We've got pretty good students. No, yeah. So first of all, I mean, I think these systems are built by teams, and often very large teams. So part of it is we would never have, a 22-year-old doing it all by themselves. They would be part of a broader team. So what I meant by that is I want them going out knowing here's the right processes and practices to use. Here's what we should be asking as questions. To go out understanding how to do it well, that part of having them be in the place of thinking it's not just that I know how to write some Python code to go from numbers to a model, but I understand the processes by which we build these systems in a way that enables me to contribute to a group effort to produce a responsible and trustworthy product. And here, I guess the analogy that I would give, or the parallel, would be to what has happened roughly 20 plus years ago with regards to user interfaces, what we now would call user experience on software. I am old enough to have been part of software projects where the way the interface was built was like, well, we're coding it. We know what people would want to do with this. And then there became this slogan, you are not your user, which was exactly intended to say we need people who know how to design better interfaces than what we as coders were doing. And I think we need to get to that same point. And now, no serious product would ever go out the door without having multiple people who work on user experience broadly. And I think we need to get to the same place in terms of responsible and trustworthy AI. That no serious product is going out the door without people who have the experience and the frameworks and the scientific grounding in how to do it well. And that's what I had in mind. Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
Thank you for your talk. I'm very interested in your dynamic certification, and obviously you had to be quick here, so I'll try to pick your brain another time. But I was wondering if you could enlighten us what role adversarial testing would play. How do we stress out these various models so that we see when it goes bad, right? Especially if we're like putting it in a healthcare context and we want to know what we would do to it that might cause harm to people.
So I'm not going to try and go back to this slide because I know the font was really, really small, even on this big screen. A generalization of adversarial testing is a key part of the second stage, which is exactly trying to find the situations where you think the system might break or perform poorly. So adversarial testing is one way to get a system to behave poorly, but it can also be things like, I'm not sure how well my autonomous car is going to work in fog-filled situations, or I'm not sure how well my diagnostic AI system that was built here at UCSD Health in an academic healthcare network, how well it's going to work in Baja California, in a rural clinic, right? And so part of it is exactly finding those places that you think things might go wrong, and then testing it there in a supervised fashion. And if you can show in a supervised fashion it's performing well, then that is part of the grounds for the certification agency saying, all right, you've shown that you can do this regularly. We're going to allow you to go into a monitoring phase there where it can function autonomously, and we're just going to keep an eye on it. But you can't just start deploying it there. You've got to do it in this supervised way, and you are rewarded for trying to get your system to screw up. Because if it does well even there, then that gives good reason to extend the context to uses of context and use.
So, question?
Yeah.
Thank you. It's very, very interesting. I found it fascinating that the Department of Defense was the first to talk about the ethical issues of interoperability, and you talked about how you want to ensure that we aren't outsourcing our ethics, right? Well, the DoD there are numerous examples of how the DoD has done exactly that, rendition program, for example, and many other things that we can talk about. So is there a possibility that if AI is programmed in such a way that it really does adhere to regulations and it really does adhere to standards and it can't futz around like the DoD does or the government does, that AI could become kind of the policeman, could hold the DoD and the government accountable for actually breaking the rules and going outside of the regulations and the standards and the best practices?
I think what you point to, I'm going to sort of generalize your question a little bit, is the ways in which AI systems can actually be incredibly powerful and valuable precisely because they can be designed to be relatively transparent, repeatable. They don't, there have been various arguments that in fact autonomous weapons are the ethically, I don't agree with the argument I'm about to make, but arguments that autonomous weapons are actually the ethically positive choice because they're not going to get angry. They're not going to commit a war crime because of hatred for the other, for the adversary. Now, I think that argument doesn't work in the normal way that it gets pitched, but I do think that there are many awful human biases. There are often many things that we do poorly, and to the extent that we can have AI help us be better versions of ourselves, we should embrace that. I think we should embrace the fact that we can use AI to recognize where those failings are. I'm reminded here of in the city of Chicago, where they built a predictive policing system. That is a system that is designed to help the police know where they should station themselves so that they can better respond to crimes. And they used historical data. And here's the catch, right? And so everyone probably in the room is going, oh, that's terrible. Oh, you can't do that. Those data are biased and all these sorts of things. The catch is they didn't build it to actually put the police there. They built it so they could figure out what their own biases were. They used the AI as a mirror, as an more objective mirror of their own practices so that they could say, oh, there are these communities that it was taking 35 minutes to respond to a 911 call. Literally 35 minutes because we didn't have anybody close to it. We need to fix that, right? So they didn't use it to guide their actions in the sense of slavishly following what the AI said. Rather, they used it to understand their own biases and failings. And so I do think that there's a tremendous power and potential for AI in those kinds of uses to help us better understand our own errors.
Okay.
Thank you very much for this talk. I'm wondering, given the diversity of the regulations and standards, possibly even diversity of principles and outcomes that may be occurring throughout the world right now, is there an effort or a conversation at least happening about standardizing or bringing into some international or global organization to begin to share and perhaps even standardize some of these very important concepts that are driving AI right now?
So yes, those conversations are happening. I am personally pessimistic that we're ever going to get to any single standard of any specificity at all. But there is, for example, the UN high-level body on AI. I don't remember the exact name, but it was launched about 4 months ago. And they're actively trying to figure out, are there sort of shared values? And interesting things are coming from that. For example, the ways in which the Global South, where of course the majority of the people live, but the Global South has very different perspectives on the potential for AI technologies compared to some of the conversations that happen in DC or London or Paris. And so, yes, those conversations are happening. As I said, I'm pessimistic that we're going to get unanimity. Where I think we're having a bit more success is in trying to find those outcomes, those zones of functionality that we can all agree on. I mean, you and I almost certainly have different ethical values in our own personal lives. And I don't mean that to impugn you, it just means because, we're humans. And so we probably have differences, but we can both agree that it would be unethical for me to run over to John, knock him down, take his wallet, and run really fast. Not just illegal, it would be unethical. And we can agree on that, right? In fact, we agree on the vast majority of problems. That's how we get through life, is that we actually largely agree about how to get along with each other. We sometimes lose sight of that with all the conflict that occurs interpersonally. And that's despite all of our differences. So one of the things that I think we're seeing in a kind of parallel track to groups like the UN, the AI Safety Summit that occurred in London, and the next one will happen in Paris, what we're seeing is a kind of parallel effort about, are there things that we can all agree on in terms of functionality, in terms of outcomes, in terms of things like data privacy, that we can all agree this is just something that, it doesn't tell us everything, but it gives us something, particularly around things like universal human rights. So those efforts are ongoing, but it's tough when you're trying to, find something that works for 8 billion people.
Thank you for the talk today. I had a question. One of the things that you shared earlier was that AI lacks context in some cases. And so my question is, and just wanted to learn a little bit about your experience in, have you seen empathy play a role in how AI is developed and or the inclusion of empathy themes in governance activities? I'm going to say this as a broad generalization. There are, of course, exceptions that prove the rule. Empathy plays a major role in the humans who are in the process. So all of these governance processes, or not all, most of them, humans are part of these systems. We don't have very many AI systems that are just kind of off doing their thing and humans are never involved at all. But empathy does play a significant role in the human side, in the human who has the ability to overrule the decision of a Social Security disability judgment, in the human who decides whether to use the system in the first place, in the human who says the empathetic thing is to go, actually, you should work with the AI system. For example, there are AI therapists. It turns out that there's one population, they are better than human therapists, namely young men suffering from PTSD. Why? The basic story is they are willing to say things to an AI precisely because it's not a human, right? So there's a kind of importance, I think, of empathy. But where we're seeing it is we're putting that burden on the human to figure this out. And I say burden deliberately because I think we often are not equipping people properly to make those kinds of decisions about where it would be empathetic to use an AI versus not, versus interpret it in particular ways. I think it's a big challenge we have.
How do you value the diversity of thoughts where, many people can approach a problem from many different ways versus the value of interoperability in AI systems? Since if multiple people can have very different ethical differences, how do we like kind of stop from all kind of conforming on some sort of subpar ethical standard?
Yeah, it's a great question. We want innovation. We want novelty. We want people trying new things, but we want to also, at some point, we need to work together, and we need our systems to play nice together. So there, the way I approach these challenges is by focusing on the outcome, performance, behavioral kind of level, and saying, I'm perfectly happy to have all of that be black box, in the sense of like, don't need to know what's going on there. And part of that is actually grounded in my own experience doing cognitive science and looking at some phenomena in social psychology about how people get along with each other. And one of the common findings is that people are best able to get along with one another when they actually worry less about other people's motivations and more about, look, are we coordinating? Think here, anybody who's ever been on a sports team. You don't have to like your teammates to be very successful. And I think that's actually, I think there's something really important about that there are many things that matter in terms of how you generate the behavior that actually don't matter in terms of coordination. And I think the same kind of idea can hold when we're looking at trying to develop new AI systems. Enormous amounts of innovation are completely consistent with us saying, okay, but it can't undermine people's autonomy. It can't violate their human rights. We can do that and still say, don't care what you're doing behind the scenes. So, yeah.
I'm going to intervene with moderator's prerogative on a question.
Okay.
Which is, so if AI replaces the truck driver going through Oklahoma, AI replaces the radiologist reading x-rays, radiologist the AI replaces other sorts of people, are there any humans that shouldn't be replaced by AI, and why? Examples include the people who care for people in memory care units. There was a person in Japan who created an AI priest. So what human should not be replaced by AI? And why is the essay question.
Sociology professors. Clearly should not be replaced by AI.
That's obvious, but beyond that.
Beyond that one. Yeah, so one of the things that I think is very important is when there are jobs that involve the human act of recognizing somebody else as human and as worthy of value simply because they are a human. I think that that's the sort of thing AI systems simply don't do. It goes back to the question about empathy. And I think that there are moments and times that it is crucial that we have recognition of one another as valuable simply because we are humans. I think it's why we feel this alienation from bureaucracies, which fail to treat us as humans, right? The datafication of our society that turns me into a series of numbers and fails to acknowledge who I am as a person. Now, what are those jobs? Well, it's a weird hybrid. Nobody has just that job. I mean, nobody has the job of, I see you, I see, like, that's not a job. But it is nonetheless, I think, imbued in many different kinds of jobs, in healthcare workers, in teachers, in mentors, in the ways that we make decisions and engage with one another to support the individual, as opposed to the numbers that describe the individual. That's probably an unsatisfactory answer to a lot of the people in the room, because I can't tell you this job class, in part because it's things like, the everyday job of a lawyer has a lot of things that AI is going to be able to do better than the lawyer. But there are those moments, there are those parts of the job that I don't see an AI being able to do in the ethically relevant ways, or even in the performance ways, anytime in the near future. And that's true of so many, you mentioned the radiologist. Well, radiologists don't just sit in a darkened room all day seeing x-rays. They also engage with patients. They coordinate with other doctors. They have to understand the needs of that individual. We're a very long way from AI being able to do that. but we're going to have massive societal disruption along the way when certain jobs are turned over to AI, even though they have this element. And I worry that we're only going to discover the importance of those human connections too late, in part for the economic reasons that were raised earlier. People are going to be able to make a lot of money doing this, even as it undercuts a fundamental piece of what what provides human community and society.
Great, thank you. One last question is over here. Yep.
No pressure.
No pressure.
Thank you. I was wondering what you think is the next bit of legislation or guideposts or change needed to help AI grow in a non-harmful way?
So I think the next piece of legislation, if it could happen, would actually be around data privacy and data protection. So data, nowadays, AI, we've gotten good enough in terms of the algorithms and the models that in many cases the constraining factor is the data, not the algorithms or the compute. So OpenAI, to go from GPT 3.5 to the ChatGPT most people know about to GPT-4, one of the two big innovations that they made in order to have that growth was significantly improving the quality of the data they were using in a variety of ways. And so I think we're seeing the importance of data in AI now. That's often the limiting factor. And we have no data privacy protection in the United States right now. We have it in specific areas, HIPAA for healthcare, FERPA for educational. We in California, if you are a California person, we have a lot of different kinds of protections, but there is no nationwide. GDPR, if you've heard about that in the European Union, you say, oh, General Data Protection Regulation. It's actually basically just a disclosure rule. There's very little protection of what they can and cannot do with your data, as long as they've told you, buried somewhere in a 50-page terms and conditions. There are almost no countries that have robust data protection right now. And I think that's the best thing we can do to move towards more trustworthy AI systems, is to help shape the fuel out of which these things are built.
So let me have a couple announcements quickly. If you're interested in more talks like this, the Institute for Practical Ethics has 1 or 2 public talks per year. Go to ipe.ucsd.edu. Somewhere on there, there's a sign up to the mailing list kind of thing. Number 2 is we have light refreshments out there in the courtyard right now, but mostly I would like to thank David Danks for a fascinating talk.